Bom dia a todos.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to have you here in this panel. There are a lot of people with us through YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the account, I'd like to thank the participation of all and say that this panel is about the control and assessment of tax expenditures. So we'll be elaborating a document for the control and assessment of renounces and taxes. So we organized this panel in order to listen to some specialists in the area about methods that may be a part of the assessment process, more reliable assessment process. And it's also an opportunity to amplify our discussion about this relevant theme, not only for Brazil, but also for all the countries. This expression of tax expenditures was created by Stanley in the 70s to emphasize the fact that the taxation represents tax benefits, and this constitutes actually a way of the government to implement public policies. So there are some examples of that in the way of the public government trying to make social programs that we have in Brazil, like Bolsa Família is an example. The government opts to reduce some taxes in products that are a part of the cesta básica. So this makes it more easy to access for the poorest people to get food. It's also a way of revenue distribution to make sure that this population is fulfilled. We can also talk about in the place of the government to finance innovation projects, also development and research projects. It allows the enterprises that invest in those areas may take that from the revenue taxation in Brazil, where policies of this nature exist. Talking a bit more about tax waiving, the tax expenditures don't get to go through the process that is deliberated and approved by the Congress and by the representatives of the legislative body. So this reduces the effectiveness and the exercise of the control made by the legislative body in Brazil that is made through an external control. And also, it acts posteriorly in this control. Society itself, this policy made through tax waiving is not that transparent as the conventional public policies. Many of these, they are indefinite.
Sometimes this timeline is not even determined, and some of them are part of our system for over 30 years, which makes the problem even worse. And many of these tax expenditures and these benefits or this revenue waiving do not go through assessment of effectiveness or assessment of viability that can prove the benefit that is brought up as well as the proportionality. In other words, whether or not the level of investment justifies the waiving of this revenue. So due to this less or smaller level of control on tax expenditure, Christopher Holland used an expression that this is about the state, the social state expanded. And he said that in the 90s, he was referring to that, to this nature of a hidden social state for social benefits that are used as public policies. In this case, we're talking about revenue waiving. Regardless of that, we have moved forward in terms of control and assessment of tax expenditure, not only in Brazil, but as well as in other countries. In other words, on an international level. On the first speeches that we'll have today, we're going to have a contextualization on the issue, and we are going to learn a little bit more about the demonstratives that were elaborated by the Brazilian revenue system that brings about more transparency to this benefit in Brazil, in addition to having a panorama of the expenditures of the states of the federation. Brazil has 26 states in the federation. In the first table in the morning, we are going to have the opportunity of knowing models of assessment of expenditures that are used internationally. Representatives of inspection entities from the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as researchers, a researcher from Germany, will present the criteria of methods that were implied in their assessment of public expenditure or tax expenditure. In the afternoon, we are going to discuss the fiscal aspect of expenditures over the perspective of a state court of account, which we are going to take a state of Brazil as an example, as well as the Federal Senate and the National Treasury, representing the executive branch. Finally, the third table will have the participation of a representative of the Court of Account of Brazil, from the Court of Accounts of the state of Rio de Janeiro, as well as the federal branch, to present national experiences on control and assessment of tax expenditure. We hope that this panel can contribute a lot to the maturing of the subject, and a benchmark document that is being elaborated by the TCU will contribute for the improvement of control and assessment of tax expenditure, not only of TCU, but also the Court of Accounts on a state level, the branches of the executive, the legislative, as well as allowing for a better monitoring and control of the civil society as a whole. I would like to thank once again the participation of everyone in this panel. This is very important for the improvement of the actions of the court that seeks to improve public policies. I would like now to hand the floor to the Secretary of Microassessment of the TCU, Mr. Leonardo, to conduct this panel and the debates. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a good event. Thank you, Julius. It's a pleasure to be with you here with so many experts that we have had the opportunity to invite, and we've been very glad for all of them have agreed to be with us here today, and we're very sure that this will be a very fructiferous day, a very fruitful day for people who deal with this subject, but more specifically for those who are linked to issues of tax, especially tax waiving. Well, Julius gave us a panorama of how the event is going to be. We're going to start with two national experts. We're going to start with Mr. Claudemir Malaquias from the National Revenue System. I believe he is probably the most qualified technician to talk about conceptual issues on tax expenditures, as well as the methodologies that we use for assessment and what they allow us to know and what are the limitations that they have. but also the mechanisms and how this is aligned with the international good practices of assessment of tax expenditure. And he will bring this vision of the national revenue system with the specificities from the tax arena, but that are fundamental. And then you're going to have Mr. Sergio Gobetti. Some of you know Mr. Sergio as a journalist, but Sergio is also a technician from the IPEA, has a lot of knowledge in tax, and especially on tax, has a lot of knowledge on tax waiving. And now, working in a state government, he is going to bring about his vision of how tax waiving happens not only on a state level, on a federal level, but also on a state level. We have the impression that the national revenue system is already very much advanced in terms of transparency. The states also need to move towards that direction, and the country as a whole needs to evolve a lot. We've seen a discussion because when we talk about public finances, this discussion is based on a single rule, which is the expenditure ceiling. And this is a rule that is in the Constitution, but it leaves aside a lot of elements of control. And one of these elements that go unseen is this tax waiving. So we have a mechanism of contention that is even stronger than what is established in the law of fiscal liability, something in the LDO, but nothing that is a mechanism of contention. So what we've seen in the last few years is a growth that is quite expressive, especially if we talk about the beginning of the first century until 2015. And then we started to have a kind of a stability of this tax expenditure in relation to the GDP, but something very high, something like 4.5% of the GDP. So we're talking about something that is very expressive from the fiscal standpoint, is very important, but it's also very important from the standpoint of public policies or the results that we expect to get from public policies. We have a series of benefits that we need to question ourselves. Are these benefits really effective, or are there other mechanisms that could be more effective? So when we think about this panel, it has this double glance. We want to understand how we can improve the control from the standpoint of inspection, but also from the standpoint of understanding tax waiving as a mechanism of financing of public policy. So this is the idea. And we start in this first panel bringing these general visions from Claudemir and Sergio so that we can then come with international experience, and then with a specific vision of fiscal aspects, as well as a vision of national experience with inspection with the states as well, the Court of Accounts on a national level, as well as the Court of Accounts on state levels. I will invite Mr. Claudemir to have the floor. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, juniors. Good morning, Leonardo, Sergio. Thank you for sharing this virtual table with me. It's a great pleasure to have you here with me, and in this opportunity, we're bringing this first contextualization of the issue that is going to be brought about in this amazing panel. We from the National Revenue System thank you for the invitation, and we are going to seek to correspond in the next 25 minutes with a conversation that is very clean, very clear about tax expenditure and how the public federal administration is dealing with the issue. I'm going to show you my presentation, and once I have confirmation that everyone can see it, then I'm going to start. Okay, we shall start then. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about expenditures, tax expenditure. Let's talk a little bit about criteria and reference system. We're going to talk about or benchmark system. We're going to talk about methodology and demonstrations. So, after all, what are we talking about? The first question that comes, it's very interesting to try to understand, because when we talk about tax expenditure, what are we talking about? And in the first moment, we face ourselves with a challenge, and these challenges are of all sorts. The first one, conceptual, methodological, operational, and accountability. We don't have a definition of what is tax expenditure. The concept of tax expenditure is something that we put the elements together and we make our interpretation. And what happens is that it is impossible to have a clear classification, a universal classification that is adopted by all the courts of account that is uniform in the sense of conceptualizing tax expenditures. We also don't have a standardization of methodology. We have a lot of challenges in this area and in operation as well on a daily basis. I mean, how I'm going to make demonstrations of expenditures, how I'm going to show that, how am I going to render account, how I'm going to be transparent in regards to these pieces of information. So we're talking about many challenges here, but let's talk a little bit about conceptualizing this first challenge, which is conceptualize tax expenditure, or bring in this panel the elements that we consider essential for the definition of what is tax expenditure, or to give us a theory on this around this issue. When we talk about this, we talk about tax waiving. And what is tax waiving? Is simply the movement of the state in the sense of waiving, for example, or giving some sort of exemption, or to give some sort of deduction of a certain fee or tax, or maybe a deduction, for example, in calculus, or a presumed credit. So tax waiving has a lot of faces. So this is a very broad subject, which could mean, for example, a lot of actions or a lot of mechanisms or instruments that the state or the legislative power uses so that when there is an incidence, it can reduce that incidence. So when we're talking about tax expenditure, the first thing that comes is the issue of relief. So every relief can be classified as tax expenditure. This is the second question. If this has to do with waiving or relief, the question is, can I say that every waiving is a tax expenditure if we are to admit technically speaking? The answer is no. Not every expenditure or every relief or waiving is a tax expenditure. Of course, not every tax waiving or tax relief is tax expenditure. For example, the exemption that is granted to the yieldings of a physical person, a natural person, up to 25,000 reais. This relief is a tax waiving or a tax relief. The state manifests through the legislator its interest of not taxing this income, which is what we call exemption level. However, this is not considered tax expenditure. This is part of the structure of the tax. So we are going to see that not every tax waiving is a synonym of tax expenditure. And that way, as we expand further, we come to the conclusion that there isn't a classical universal formula to classify the tax relief as expenditure. Because if I know that every tax relief cannot be classified as expenditure, I need some technical level to separate. But we give you further answer. There isn't a classical form. Every country is, or every state is going to develop its own methodology, its own construction, its own methodology to classify that. But in this work of classification, to try to classification and set aside the tax expenditures, we're going to start to determine the elements that we call elements that are intrinsic to tax expenditure, and that in their absence, I cannot say that I am facing tax expenditure. I can say that I'm just facing tax relief. And what are these elements? Well, I'm going to give you a list. And in this exercise that we're doing today very quickly, only in 20 minutes, we're going to try to debate on some of the items. Just to contextualize how we conceptualize, or the Brazilian National Revenue System classifies tax expenditures. And so the first element that we question that has to be there is the reduction of the amount of tax that is owed. There are some regimes in customs, for example, that do not consider tax expenditure because there isn't a reduction. For example, in tax income or income tax, when I deal with, for example, an anticipation, for example, I do not have a reduction of the tax, so I cannot characterize that as a tax expenditure. The same thing holds true for special customs. So the reduction of the amount that is owed is an element that has to be present. So there has to be effectively a loss of revenue collection. The second element that identifies is the treatment, the differentiated treatment that reaches only part of taxpayers. Here there are a lot of questions about what is this differentiated treatment that reaches only part of taxpayers. Sometimes this part of taxpayers, they are in a certain region. Sometimes the part of these taxpayers could be taxpayers that meet certain criteria. So there is a lot of room for discussions around this element, but it has to be present. In other words, tax expenditure is a tax waiving that is given in a non-general character. This is the expression that is in Article 14. So it's a tax waiving or tax relief that is classified as expenditure because it has a non-general character. In other words, it reaches only a part of the taxpayers. The third element without which I cannot talk about tax expenditure. Tax waiving that is classified as expenditure has to represent an exemption or a deviation of the structure that is considered normal. This expression of a structure that is considered normal in terms of taxation, we call it the benchmark tax system. In fact, this is the system with which I am going to compare to make the assessment of these expenditures. So there has to be a difference or a deviation, because if there isn't a difference between a tax treatment that I am giving, that I am calling tax waiving, and a system that is considered to be preferential, I cannot simply say that I am facing tax expenditure. These are the elements that we consider to be not negotiable. But there are other elements that could not be present. And there are some authors who are very flexible. We as well. We do not condition that to the existence, a mandatory expenditure. There are some elements that could be there or not. We are not here to discuss them right now, but the first one is the connection to the objective. So tax expenditure should or must be linked to some sort of objective. This objective regards a governmental action. I cannot have a tax expenditure simply without any objective. I mean, tax expenditure will always have a certain objective behind. And here in Brazil, we like to say that there is a strong link between tax expenditure and the public policies that they are financing. So if I don't have behind tax expenditure the public policy behind which I am financing, I cannot classify it as tax expenditure. I will classify it just as tax waiving. For example, exemption of baggage that is brought by, or luggage that is brought by travelers. So I'm a resident of Brazil, I travel abroad and I do some purchasing. When I come back, I have a limit of exemption that I am entitled to. This limit of exemption in my luggage has no public policy behind. It's just tax waiving, so there is no objective. So I cannot classify that as tax expenditure. However, there are certain items that are linked to a certain public policy to incentivize technology, for example, research or even regional development. That expenditure, because it has an objective, because it has a goal, then that is classified as an expenditure. Another element that could be present is its functionality in regards to direct expenditure. Some countries only considered tax expenditure that which fuses with direct expenditure. In other words, it's an expenditure that I chose because it's easier to do a tax waiving as a way of financing public policies, but also this public policy can or should be financed through direct expenditure. In other words, budgetary expenditure. So there is a restriction with countries that use that criteria as element. They reduce a lot of their expenditure because not all expenditure can be deduced in this direct expenditure. So these are the characteristics of expenditure. And you can see that it goes through the identification of these elements. Going on, I have cited the expression, the normal structure, and now I'm using the reference. So how do I know what is a reference or benchmark system? Because I need a parameter. So what is my parameter to consider that there was a reduction of taxation or a tax waiving? I need to have a parameter, and this parameter we call the normal structure of taxation. So to identify what is, for every expenditure, for every tax, what is its reference system or benchmark system. And so here I have another theory which we try to establish the system of reference within some elements that are reference to establish what is a reference system and how I choose the reference system. This is also a great challenge for us because there are a lot of options that come out. And today we have a big struggle in regards to simples because there is a lot of questions from some authors and experts in the sense that the choosing of the tax benchmark system made by the national system is mistaken. So we try to explain technically that this is the best technical option for the assessment of tax expenditure of simples. So what are the elements that we have identified and that we use to identify the tax benchmark system? The tax system has principles. So whenever I deviate from these principles, I will be facing an expenditure, which allows me to adopt the benchmark system or that part of the system that adopts this system. I don't know if I'm being clear, but we try to intensify within the tax benchmark reference system how much as we waive tax, it moves away from this principle. So for example, I'll get the first one. The first principle, the principle of equity, establishes that the same cargo has to be established for a taxpayer in equivalent situations. So if I have a lot of taxpayers in the same situation, and for some I give a differentiated treatment, what happens? I am hurting or damaging this principle of equity. So to me, my reference system will be the system or the fiscal system that does not hurt that system. The same holds true for progressiveness. I have a principle that says that the income tax has to be taxed according to progressivity. In other words, taxpayers who can pay more have to pay more than those who can't. So if I create a system in which I hurt the progressiveness of the system is deviating. And this deviation is the tax expenditure. And my system of reference is the general rule that is the same for all the taxpayers. In general rules, this is it. The same regards for neutrality. If I have a rule that aims at ensuring the neutrality, economic as well as the allocation of resource, and through tax waiving, I try to induce the behavior of taxpayer or the productive agent so that it will make an allocation of resources that is induced, then my tax system, my benchmark system will be the rule that does not induce to this kind of differentiated behavior. This is just to give you an example of how we choose our benchmark tax system. The Brazilian revenue system published a primer in regards to all the 138 expenditures, and we're going to show you a link at the end of our presentation. So, tax expenditure. So it is easier to define now what is tax expenditure with these initial comments being made. So it would be all the waiving that would result in deviations in regards to these characteristics of the systems of taxation. And somehow, that would somehow be linked to some sort of action. So with these elements, we can start to build a concept. The revenue system adopts these concepts that are indirect expenditures of the government, in other words, not in the budgetary but through the expenditure system that aims at meeting the social and economic goals. The federal revenue system used this system that, as we said, you don't need to have an expenditure linked to social or economic expenditure. Makes it easy for the understanding, but it's not vital. Now, this may sound a restriction of all the possibilities of establishing expenditures in government policies, but we seek in putting the words economic and social of all the finalities, including cultural, artistic, administrative, involving all of the issues that could be involving a public policy and not just specifically economic and social aspects, but as a whole. And I finish here with all the equitude of the actions of government, which constitute an exception, in other words, a deviation to the tax system, reducing potential collection. That is what we call a fictitious collection for that role. And as a consequence, increasing the economical availability of the taxpayer. In other words, I need to see that there was some sort of an advantage for the taxpayer. But the great challenge is, how are we going to identify the deviations classified as expenditure? And then we start to get a little bit in the methodology that the Brazilian revenue system adopts to establish the reference or benchmark, taxation system. So, as a rule, and using some of the concepts that are used in other countries, the benchmark taxation can be defined by three modules. First, by conceptualization. In other words, the policymaker establishes the concept of theory model of taxation, and whatever deviates from that concept or from that theory is considered as expenditure. This is not easy because in reality, this involves a lot of subjectivity in which you need to consider what is the theoretical concept of taxation for this kind of finality. Another way of establishing the benchmark system is through a subsidy, but that doesn't encompass all the situations. I'm not always able to transform to make rationale of an expenditure as if it were within direct expenditure or within the budget. And finally, that was the option made by Brazil regards the legal base. In other words, the revenue will the revenue system will take its action based on the law, and this is the best definition. What does the law establish as general rule? Well, for these taxpayers, the amount is not 10, it's 3%. And the wave to be measured will be the difference between the 10% that is charged by the benchmark system and the 10% that I'm charging for the taxpayers, in which who was granted the benefit. So the Brazilian revenue uses this system, and the base is in our constitution, in the tax law. In other words, it's not something that is unknown. Everybody knows that we have in Brazil very strongly the principle of the legality, fiscal legality, or fiscal reservation on everything that can be waived has to be in the law. And this is very good because the laws, the classification go through the legal system, and everything that is being understood as positive is then put in the classification of tax expenditure. But of course, we're talking about a law in a broad system. But what we consider is that which we call fiscal legislation, and there are some principles in addition to the reference of the doctrine. Well, how do we assess these expenditures? I'm going to talk about methodology. I may be coming to the end of my time, so of course we are not going to go through all the methodologies. The Brazilian revenue system published another primer with the methodology for all of the 100 and something expenditures. In these methodologies that we call methodological primer, we describe the routine or the way of assessment of each one of the benefits and expenditure. But in theory, we can classify the methodologies under three forms, and I will explain what is the one that we adopted. The first one is that it uses as a criteria to measure the loss or reduction of collection, of tax collection. There is another method that is a little bit more complex. It's a method that I come from the idea that I have the loss of financing, but or collection, tax collection, but I consider in the measuring of the tax expenditure the positive effects. And why is that? Because we come from the principle that every expenditure has a public policy or has an objective behind. What is going to happen to this tax waiving or tax relief? The economical activity will be increased, and the increase in this economy can bring the collection of other taxes, another one that was waived. With this methodology, we consider not just the waiving or relief, but also the gain in collection which is gotten through the implementation of that policy. This method we do not adopt in Brazil because of the complexity and the time it takes to make the assessment of those gains. We need to establish models, something with a little more complexity, and we don't have that time, especially because in Brazil we don't have 5 public expenditure. We have 138. So things change, right? So the complexity multiplies in a level that makes it impossible for us to adopt this criteria. The second methodology is the equivalent tax expenditure. For example, ProUni is a tax expenditure. And how could we measure ProUni using this alternate methodology? Well, it would mean to transfer this expenditure of ProUni, which is a tax expenditure, to effective expenditure. It's like a direct transference of income. If I were to pay, for example, a scholar, how much would I pay, for example, in a given state or municipality? So it takes a lot of precision, and of course, that goes back to a lot of research to make this assessment between the expenditure and the waiving, as well as the assessment of, for example, how much it costs, for example, a scholarship for a student. So I would have a plurality of amounts. That would make the assessment very complex. And I'm talking about ProUni, which is actually simple. Now, can you imagine if you were to adopt this methodology for all the expenditures? So in Brazil, we adopt a model of loss in collection because of rendering this process a lot more agile. It is much easier for us to make an assessment of expenditure using this methodology of the loss in collection. In other words, I just assess how much was not collected. Of course, there are some reservations. Every methodological choice has to be made and held specified with some reservations. And sometimes we hear a lot of comments about the methodologies that the IRS of Brazil uses, but the comments do not deal with the reservations. We are aware of the reservations because the methodological choice was made following some technical criteria. But we don't know the limitations of this methodology, and it is important to make some reservations. For example, this methodology makes it impossible any addition of the expenditure because it deals with the loss. If you add all the expenditures, then you're going to have an amount that is not real. And in fact, I don't have that in loss. In fact, I have to make a compensation, but with this methodology, I cannot do that. Another limitation regards the assessment of the involvement. When we look at the historical settings series, I'm going to show you the graphic, we have to take that into account. And then when another limitation is that we consider only the effect of reduction. So this limitation has to be explicit, saying that the loss in collection is an estimate amount and not of the public policy as a whole. Let's go very quickly to the very final part, which are the statements or demonstrations. I could not come out of this panel without bringing some numbers. And this evolvement, we show since 2007 the evolvement of the expenditures. But why do we show you this evolvement and its finality? Is just to show that we are in a trajectory of expansion of these expenditures. And we at the IRS would say that we are in a trajectory of an uncontrolled expansion of expenditure. And this is very easy during a moment of unbalance to promote, along with the Parliament, the approval of measures that will benefit a certain public policy. It's much easier to do that than to be able to get some sort of financial input. And of course, this is something that may generate a very serious fiscal problem. So it is understandable that there is a lot of pressure for the expansion of expenditure, but that brings risks. Everybody knows that the expansion of tax expenditure today is in a competition with a lot of malices for the system as a whole, because it brings complexity and it favors the allocation or irregular allocation of funds or bad, in addition to bring an excessive complexity to the fiscal system as a whole. Last week, we had a meeting with the minister and we were discussing about this issue, and we told him, we said, in addition to these three consequences of the expansion of expenditure, we have another one. In other words, the minister has lost the capacity of exercising the fiscal policy. In other words, there is such a saturation of benefits, such a saturation of micro-regime, that the Minister of the Economy cannot implement a policy with this expenditure, which is something that he should be allowed to do. So the system has become so broad in regard to these benefits and expenditures that has held impossible the application of the policy. In other words, the mechanism has been rendered sterilized for the induction of behaviors of taxpayers. And we have a comparison of the expenditure with the GDP and collection, which shows a growing participation in the current moment. We are in a plateau, a sort of stability, but we also are on a very high level when we look at our expenditures. Well, if we were to classify expenditures in amounts and measure, and this is in a comparison that has to be made by all the states, we would have this distribution among the main expenditures. These numbers and these proportions are from 2017. That are the expenditures that were assessed, and I'm going to mention more on that. So this is the composition of the expenditure. You have the opportunity to look at it later. So there is a follow-up that we do. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the complexity of what it means as we attempt to measure these expenditures. So along the years, if we look, we are going to keep a very high level of expenditures. So in 2017, we had 138 expenditures along with that we are monitoring. And as we present the reports today, we work with these 138. In 2020, the year that we are now, we have 123 expenditures to assess, to measure, classify, and to do all of the analytical statements or demonstrations that you're going to get to know soon. So this is a huge number. And what scares us the most is the sequence. Look, until 2073, we're going to have 95 expenditures if nothing is changed. In other words, in the next 50 years, we have our job. I like to tell my team, I say, look, we are going to leave here and the job will not be finished. We have work to do for over 50 years, I joke. And what is interesting, we have 89 expenditures that have no timeline. In other words, we're going to leave it for the generations to come. And this is crazy in terms of governance, in terms of results, in terms of public policy. If we consider a public policy that has no timeline. Now, to finish, I bring you the places where all of the demonstrations are, or the statements are published. We can't open them here because there are so many tables, so many images, and the objective here is to show you where they are and where they are published. And we've published in this place here that we call open data, all right? And here in open data, in Portuguese, dados abertos, we have the demonstration from Peloa. This demonstration is, this statement is published until the 31st of August of every year, and it follows the project of the bill, of the budgetary law, on a daily yearly basis. This is a kind of statement. The other statement is the statement of tax expenditure in effective basis. So we have estimates that are made on a yearly basis, and in the month of March, we publish the statements with the estimates that were remade from the information that were given by taxpayers, that we call the effective basis, which is the expenditure on effective basis. So these two sets of statements, and you have the whole series, everything is available on the website. All of this set of estimates, they represent the set of estimates that are available and that we contribute for the functions of control and assessment of public policies. The Brazilian revenue system is responsible only for the measurement of the tax expenditure. It doesn't follow the policy or the objectives of the policy or the reaching of the goals that were established, that were financed by a certain resource. It only measures based on the criteria and a reference that we are presented here. I will finish here. And once again, I would like to thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that I have presented to you all the elements that are essential, at least to give you a demonstration of how the Brazilian revenue system has working on this issue. Sorry for taking longer than the time allotted, but I needed to make these comments. And we are available for further contact to clarify questions or doubts. Thank you for your attention. Have a wonderful event until the end of the day. Thank you, Claudemir. The presentation was awesome. We started well with this idea, right, of having conceptualization, understand what we're talking about when we talk about expenditure, make a very good understanding, and understand how the methodologies do exist and what are the benefits and what are the limitations. I believe that we have fulfilled this first task. And in order to gain time, I'm going to give the floor to Sergio, who's going to bring his vision as a researcher and also bringing a state view on the tax waves that we have on the state level. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I thank you the opportunity from the Federal Court of Accounts. I'm trying to share my screen with you so you can see my presentation. Can you see my presentation? Is it okay? Good. So Claudemir's presentation already told you a bit about the presentation, about the concept and methodological aspects of tax expenditures. But I believe it's a very good presentation. It allows us to reflect and think about some things that I will say at the end of my presentation. from the presentation of Claudemir and what I want to present to you. I will do that at the end. But before that, as we can see, the evolution of the measuring of tax expenditures at a federal level is it's well done. We've been doing this for a long time, and it's clear in the exposition of Claudemir. We don't have that in the scope of the state. For a series of reasons, I would say that the enforcement of the law of tax liability hasn't been effective in giving society a detailed scope in the state field. We don't know nowadays how many are the tax expenditures at a state level. Neither the methodologies applied in the measuring of the tax expenditures. We don't even have an idea of the effectiveness of these tax expenditures in relation to the objectives to which they want to reach. I will present the case of the project of the Great South, which was developed more recently. But in first hand, I would tell you for this work that was developed in Rio Grande do Sul, we found out that beyond the work that was made recently in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, the studies, only in Goiás and in the state of Santa Catarina made by the Court of Accounts of Santa Catarina, studies with the objective of assessing the effectiveness of this kind of public policy. So they are sporadic studies, and in few units of the federation, we can see those studies. Some states don't even publish, and the assessment with estimative of renouncing of ICMS, there weren't assessments and analysis of these published pieces reveal inconsistency and lack of methodology. So we show that to you through this study for the assessment of the incentives of Rio Grande do Sul, and it's detailed in a study of 2014 that Roberto Afonso and other researchers made for the Inter-American Bank. And it shows a lack of uniformity and an unequal way and consistencies in the way of how the states assess and publish the values. And this table shows the efforts that we did last year, because besides assessing Rio Grande do Sul, we tried to measure the magnitude of this in comparison with the rest of the country. It was necessary to have a methodological uniformity, and we got to make a request, file a request through our Treasury Secretary, where we established the methodology we were indicating to make this assessment. And sadly, few states answered. There was a very low level of answer, and the answers we got were insufficient. And this table was built from the tax law, except from the table of Rio Grande do Sul, which was a little better adjusted. As you can see, there is a state, Sergipe. We couldn't find any data of any year. Mato Grosso do Sul also, since 2012, stopped publishing. The attachment referred to the estimative of the revenue. So I'm talking about my presentation and the process. In Rio Grande do Sul is from a far distance the main source of income of the state. So as you can see, there are states that actually adopt tax waiving assessment in a broader way. Some present the waiving with the approval of CONFACT, and for other states it's the opposite. They don't add in the estimative of tax waiving that those expenditures and many incentives related to tax war were omitted by some states from these tables. So in this sense, it's very difficult for us to have a good comparison at a national level. And it's unacceptable that we are in 2020 and the union and the federal government has advanced so much in this assessment, and that on the states, we still have the situation of low quality of the information and few analysis of tax expenditures. And this, in many cases, is related to the environment of tax war of ICMS, and it has a weight on our evolution. And we could approve the LC 160, which try to end the tax war that obligated states to publish and give broadly share the information of the tax expenditures. So besides this institutional advance, it's still very problematic, as I showed you on the table, the assessment of the tax waiving of ICMS. I would say this is a slow process of perfectioning of the methodologies and transparency. And even for liability law, and this process of perfectioning has been happening more by pressure of some institutions in some states and some bodies, and the assessment of some treasury secretariat that try to demand more transparency. When some people actually make the difference in determined positions, they get this challenge of improving transparency, and this translates into the publishings of the state. I would also say that we have experience in pioneer projects of some states, such as Rio Grande do Sul. And we also have similar studies made in the state of Goiás and also in the state of Santa Catarina that show that this experience may serve as a pilot, as a pioneer of an application at a national level. For this to occur, I believe we need a coordinating force of the federal government or CONFAS, and maybe some normative commands that are more effective. The experience of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, the Treasury Secretariat has made many, has tried hard to perfection the process of the management of tax waiving and even the process of monitoring. There's a problem of not evaluating, the problem of evaluating posteriorly is that you don't have indicators that were previously stipulated, and you don't have, there's no object clearly defined. So is it to increase, to have more jobs, or to improve the sector, and this makes it difficult, the assessment process made posteriorly. Initially, I would say that the Treasury Secretary of Rio Grande do Sul presents the higher level of transparency in the presentation of the tax waiving, and it publishes demonstrations of the expenditures and details not only the modalities of expenditures, but also present the enterprises that receive some tax incentives without violating the secrecy, the tax secrecy. But when we talk about these expenditures in the states, we would have three, maybe four modalities. When we talk about exemption and reduction of taxes in a general level, we have a simple way. In the case of Rio Grande do Sul, we have additional wave, which is additional tax load for the enterprises, and we also have the modality of credit. And it's interesting to notice that in this case, presumed credit, this was an institutional solution, an evolution in the way of how the incentives are given from the state. So if you check the story of Rio Grande do Sul, in the 60s or 70s, there were no such incentives. What happened in the time were subsidies, budgetary or financial subsidies, very similar to what happens today as the subsidies in the BNDES ambit or scope. Posteriorly, besides the subsidies for private financing through budget, in a determined moment, they also started being related to the connection of BNDES. If the revenue generated a determined value or implementation, it had the right to get a part of this implement that was generated back. They could have a devolution of 50%, for example. But see that this used to be a tax or budgetary tool that was not related to loans anymore, but it was still budgetary. And in the decade, in the 90s, this evolved to what kind of benefit to the presumed credits instead of getting and then giving back. They started presuming credit at the time of the assessment of the tax. So this system is today used, although many states have more recently linked this presumed credit in a way of, in the form of a loan with low interest rate. So the enterprise doesn't pay ICMS at a determined moment and pays with partially this through the months, and this makes it more difficult to check the fiscal incentives. So we would need to measure cost of opportunity of this tax that is not being get today, but will be paid futurely. Besides this technical aspect and this work of institutional perfectioning that's been happening for a long time at Rio Grande do Sul, and the perfectioning of the methodologies, More recently, the current government took a step forward and created a technical group with the objective of reviewing those methodologies applied and evaluating the effectiveness of the tax incentives. This project of economical analysis of the incentives lasted for about a year and was concluded now in June of 2020 and has materialized itself in a broad report which you can have access through that link, which will be available for you. And the result of this report and the recommendations of this report had an influence on the recent proposal of tax reform that Rio Grande do Sul had put to the Assembly. Since July, a debate was initiated about the tax reform that wanted to reduce tax waiving. I will talk about that later. Claudemiro has talked about cesta básica, and this was one of the matters that they wanted to review and substitute the mechanism of tax waiving by product of the cesta básica for a personalized tax waiving as is predicted in the current proposal 45 at a national level, with this mechanism of the personalized evolution that focuses on the poorest, on the poor families. And sadly, due to the difficulty of municipal elections, that idea was not well received. So they took that proposal down, and it was based in a great technical work by Rio Grande do Sul. Such work that this study of fiscal incentives could count on this technical team with people from the federal revenue and people of the state and the Department of Economy Statistics of Rio Grande do Sul, and also the participation of some researchers of the university and people from the Ministry of the Economy. SECAP teams have also worked in this assessment, making a study of the impact of tax incentives in the perspective of jobs. I will briefly talk about this assessment work. I believe some things can be useful to elucidate and help to bring to you, or to bring to the rest of the country some help. So it's a great reference for the rest of the country, what was done at Rio Grande do Sul. Here, a historical evolution, we try to recapitulate a historical scope of the tax incentives. Just a second. Okay, and by adopting the concept of tax expenditure, there was a cut for the first time that was made. I told you that in the state there was a measuring of the tax expenditure, but the tax waiving that was presented by Rio Grande do Sul, there were tax waivings that we detected that would not effectively reduce the collection. That was clear in the speech of Claudemiro. So we talk about exemptions with that effect. For example, when you get an exemption for livestock impact, so I could move on for the next level. So in practice, what I stop collecting now, this tax waiving, if I charged the tax, it would generate credit on the next level, on the next step. So this is an example of an exemption that historically was included and is still included in the estimative of tax waiving, and we don't classify as tax expenditure. Another example of that are exemption that we call merely operational, with the circulation of goods. So enterprises that produces beverages, so that would generate a launching of the tax. That was not an economical event, and we should stipulate the exemption, and this was not accounted for. And there is no sense in classifying as tax expenditure the importation or exportation of goods. So we got to this measuring of effective tax expenditure. I will not get into details, so I keep my speech short. But it's stabilized in 1.7% of the GDP of Rio Grande do Sul. But if we take a look at historical retrospective, we see that this tax expenditure has grown a lot. I would say there are two different phases. One, where the presumed credit, which is a tax incentive for the enterprises, and from the tax war itself, it grew on the 90s. It went from 0.8 to 0.2 to 0.8, and more recently, when it stabilizes, we have a growth in more recent period of other tax expenditures, or for example, tax expenditure associated to the national simple or gaúcho, or from the Rio Grande do Sul, which is referred to ICMS, and also the exemptions and reductions that in many cases, in this case, is not what we classify as tax waiving, with the objective of fulfilling the competitivity between the enterprises, but it's typically for the consumer, for the cesta básica and other products, reduction of the basis for calculation in the case of cars. So some of these tax expenditures are so classified and patternized at a national level. All the states conceive this, but as Claudomir said, we consider as deviation of the general rule of the tax that we have as a reference of 17 or 80%, depending on the state. We see that historically, fiscal incentives, tax waiving, and tax expenditure has grown a lot, and this happens not only at Rio Grande do Sul, but for sure in the rest of the country. Here we have a detailing by economical sector, and another interesting thing that we could take a look at is how this erosion of the traditional tax basis of ICMS due to the tax incentives was compensated by the elevation of taxing that we nominate blue chips. So the taxing of fuel, communication, and energy, which are the only items, the only goods and services taxed by ICMS completely and fully, so they are not submitted to the tax war. So we get to the year of 2005, 2006, when we see that those two lines in the graphic are very close. More than 45% of the collection of ICMS at Rio Grande do Sul was only on the blue chips. So chips of communication, this is not only a Rio Grande do Sul reality, it's a national reality. The states eroding a great part of its traditional tax bases and carrying the taxing of these three goods and services that today at minimum is 25% on the sectors. At Rio de Janeiro, it gets to 34%. The tax rate gets to 34%. And the tax rate is equivalent to its very elevated tax rate. So this is a problem that is very worrisome because there is a lack of uniformity that's very great, as we can see in this graphic that I will skip. And we tried to analyze, after measuring all this, in first place, if this lack of this contributes to the fiscal justice, or if it reduces the regressivity of ICMS. In the case mainly in the tax waiving with the object of exonerating consumption. In the second place, if the fiscal incentives for the enterprises have had any economical impact, a positive economical impact. I will not present to you the detailed results. I will make it available for whoever has an interest in taking a look at it. And here also my presentation. So we can make an analysis of the heterogeneity of these fiscal incentives in every sector, and it varies a lot. So the production of meat, for example, has a fiscal incentive equivalent of 62%, and there are sectors in which this fiscal incentive is near zero. And on the other hand, we have adopted a series of methodologies to analyze those impacts, economical impacts, and the results are not absolutely conclusive. Therefore, in general, we haven't been able to assess those fiscal incentives, if they had, in a general way, positive impacts in many sectors, although this hypothesis was not discarded, that there were positive impacts. Why don't we discard the idea? Because it's very difficult to make this analysis with the environment of tax war. It's very hard for us to exercise that. So how would it be if the incentives were not being given without the presence of the tax war? So many times we were not able to detect if that sector had grown, but we don't know that if the incentive was taken back, taken away, if this these goods and production of services would not have been dislocated for another state that gives better incentives. A series of studies from ISECAP, the Ministry of the Economy, tried to look into the impact of the jobs in the sector, but we could not detect a significant impact upon statistically significant about the level of works, of jobs, but we try to appropriate those methodologies applied and try to build better databases that allow us to have a greater control of those effects. In econometrical language, if we could work better, the treatment group and a control group of this in this impact analysis of the tax incentives. we also we also noticed, we also adopted a study, the matrix and project, that was very interesting for us to try to understand the index of chain and try to assess what many people say, that tax incentives would self-pay because there would be a multiplier effect. And the results we had show that in one or another sector have development, a growth near the necessary, but the majority of the sectors don't have a growth that can guarantee the tax incentives to self-pay in terms of economical effects. So this analysis, cost benefit, was made, and also the notion of regressiveness. What we noticed, what we used was a study based on the analysis of the consumption of the families of Rio Grande do Sul by income. And the conclusion we got to was that ICMS is a tax that is regressive. As you see, it weighs more on the income of the poorer families, but what surprised us was that it not only affects more the poorer families, but in proportion to the consumption, also honors the poor families. This is something relatively surprising because you can see that the tax rate paid by the poor families is 14% and 15.1% in the average income families, and it decays for 13% in the richer families. So the tax selectivity, the use of the tax rates, and the compound of tax waiving that today, not only in ICMS of Rio Grande do Sul, but at a national level, it doesn't attenuate regressiveness, they aggravate this. And this discovery, as I said, it's not exclusive of Rio Grande do Sul's ICMS. People from SECAP found something similar and equivalent to PIS/COFINS at a national level. A study of mine and Rodrigo from IPEA also gets to the same conclusion. When we consolidate the compound of tax rates on consumption in the country, we get to the same conclusion, that the current tax rate on the consumption is a bit more regressive if we had a unified tax rate. So it shows that the selectiveness of that in an aggregated level are not attenuating regressiveness. And also when we analyze the tax waiving of cesta básica, we also get to the conclusion that only 15% of the tax waiving is benefiting the 20% of the population that are the poorer. On another hand, a third of this tax waiving of the cesta básica is benefiting the 20% that are richer. So we are entering a different sphere of, as I mentioned before, we were talking about the measuring problems of the tax expenditures, and we went through an analysis of effectiveness of these expenditures. And I end my speech with a few suggestions at a national level. I believe that from the legal and normative point of view, maybe it's necessary to distinguish that in another demonstrative of the compensatory measures predicted in LRF. There is a misunderstanding about the criteria adopted by many states. On many states, they present not demonstrative of the tax expenditures, but let's say of the tax waiving that are being implemented currently in that year, in that period. From the point of view of the measuring of tax expenditures, I believe it would be easier to create a forum for discussion amongst the states and maybe be applied nationally. From the economical point of view, it's important for us to appropriate the assessment of the impact and the database used in this kind of study, so that those impact analyses are more detailed than what is presented in the reports and the average reports. Lastly, I would like to quickly talk about what Claudomiro has presented.
We need to be very careful because we need to know how to separate the issue of these statements in terms of transparency from the problem of application of fiscal rules. I believe that the methodologies of measurement of tax expenditures and all of these methodologies, they have to be improved, they have to be standardized. I would say that we need to harden in terms of demanding how this is done. But not necessarily, I'm not saying that this is necessarily, that these statements are the best instrument to apply a rule, a fiscal rule, or impose limitations to public tax law, for example. The measurement of the tax expenditure is being made from a criteria that do not take into account the dynamic effect of these fiscal incentive that can or cannot exist. And this is the problem. We don't know, for example, we don't have an assessment whether or not these effects are happening or if they're not. But if we were concerned about the fiscal balance, then we need to have an assessment of these dynamic effects. If these policies are generating by themselves any kind of compensatory effect, which in the current legislation, this flexibilization of assessment does not exist. And the lack of existence of this flexibility sometimes can be very bad for the exercise of control itself, for the effectiveness of the policy of control, fiscal control. The creative accountability that we know is a product, among other things, of fiscal rules that are excessively rigid. So I believe that we need to think of this thing in a more differentiated fashion. The criteria of measurement and application of fiscal rules. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you very much, Sergio, for bringing this vision of the states, which shows that we have concentrated on the national debate. But when we consider the size of the tax wave in terms of states, we're talking about 27 federal states. We see that the problem is much bigger, not only from the standpoint of dimension, but also from the standpoint of influences that we have and all the issues that are caused and all of the complexity of this fiscal system. Thank you for bringing this vision. This will help us a lot in the debates in the afternoon. We are a little bit behind the schedule, so I'm going to hand the floor to Rafael so we can start the international event with all the speakers that are here today from the United States, Germany, and England. Rafael, the floor is yours. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to start my speech now in English. We have two channels. For the record, we have two channels on YouTube. one that will be in English and another one with simultaneous interpretation into Portuguese. So you can choose the one that is best for you, all right? Olá, pessoal, meu nome é Rafael e é uma honra e um privilégio recebê-lo neste webinário sobre o controle e avaliação das despesas fiscais. Gostaria de lembrar
panel will take place in English and that TCU is broadcasting 2 channels on YouTube, one in the original English audio and the other with simultaneous translation into Portuguese. So this event was organized with the object of broadening the discussion about these types of revenue waivers, seeking to support the preparation of a reference document for the control of tax benefits by TCU units, but also by the courts of accountants of the states of the federation, agents of the legislative and the executive branch, and civil society as a whole. As discussed in the opening of the webinar by our coordinator, Junior Zarifa, the expression tax expenditures was created in the 1970s by Stanley Shurry to emphasize the fact that many tax benefits are granted with the aim of promoting public policy or inducing certain behaviors considered desirable. For example, through them the government can foster research and development in companies, induce regional development, promote sustainable technologies, among other objectives. Although these so-called expenditures are not included in the government budget, we understand that they must be considered as public expenditure for the purpose of control and evaluation. In this panel, we will have the opportunity to learn about some of the most robust tax expenditure assessment frameworks in the world, developed by the Supreme Audit Institutions of the United States and the United Kingdom, the Government Accountability Office and the National Audit Office, in addition to the framework developed by FIFO, Institute for Public Economics at the University of Cologne, used by the German Ministry of Finance. Although we are experiencing a time of great concern for people's health and well-being, something extremely positive that emerged from this worldwide pandemic was the diffusion of communication technologies. At a time when people had to get away from each other, technology has allowed them to stay close, at least virtually. So today it's possible to talk to people in different countries with great ease. I'm very grateful for the effort that the speakers made to be here with us, sharing their experiences. The first to speak will be the Executive Director of the FIFO Institute, Michael Thorne. Then we will have a presentation by Andy Morrison, Director of Value for Money Audit of the National Audit Office. Then the Government Accountability Office model will be presented by its Director of Strategic Issues, Jay McTeague. I remind all viewers on both YouTube channels that you can ask questions via the chat and that they will be presented to the speakers at the end of the 3 presentations when we will have a period for debate. I see here that we already have a good audience on YouTube. I would like to ask you to inform in the chat where are you from and what institution you work, so that we can get to know our audience better. So with great pleasure, I would like to pass the floor to Michael Thorne, Executive Director of the FIFO Institute.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rafa, for the kind introduction, and yeah, hello, and to everyone already participating in the workshop. I have already seen that you have already been intensively working on these issues, although I must confess that the Portuguese part wasn't actually not quite accessible for me. I'm sorry for that, and so I'm even more grateful that we have the chance to have an English exchange. Yes, so without further ado, I'd like to start into the German evaluation of tax expenditures. For that, I've prepared a few slides, and I'm trying, and hopefully that is working quite, hopefully it's working well. I'm starting it, and I hope you see now my presentation on tax expenditures. Yes, so as you see, I'm the managing director of this institute, which is Fifo, because in Germany it's Finanzwissenschaftliches Forschungsinstitut. You see, it's a public economics institute. We're based at the University of Cologne, although we're not quite the normal university institute, as we're exclusively we're with researchers, but we're working not only on academic research, but mainly on policy-oriented research. So making research useful for political practice, and as public economics and public finances is our main field. We have been working for many years, and I personally have been working for at least 20 years on subsidies and on tax subsidies, and so we came in quite naturally to be one of the institutes. It's not only us, but it's one of the institutes that have been evaluating tax expenditures, tax subsidies in Germany in the last roughly 15 years. And now I'll give you a short overview of what we're doing and concentrating on the main issues. Somebody is not muted, but I guess you'll find out. It's not, I hope you still can hear me quite well. Okay, great. So what is the background? The background in Germany that we are, we means Germany, as you may know, is a federal state with 3 levels: the federation, the central government. Then we have 16 states, or what we call the 16 Länder, and then we have a municipal level with about 11,000 cities, villages, and counties. And all these 3 levels, they have all their own, they have their own taxes, but relating to tax subsidies, all of these tax subsidies, tax expenditures are covered in one report, and that is the report you see here. It's the federal report. In Germany, we have a long tradition since 1967 to have roughly every 2 years a subsidy report, and the Ministry of Finance reports on mainly on its own subsidies, so it's federal subsidies, direct subsidies, and tax subsidies as well. And today we're only speaking about tax subsidies, and this reporting is a very, very valuable source of information. Has become over the years and decades. Well, it has become bigger, but it has become especially more informative and useful for the control of subsidies. And but actually it's not a natural thing for a part of the government to participate in the control of subsidies. But as you all know, ministries of finances have always double roles. On the one hand, they are parts of the government, and current Minister of Finance, Olaf Scholz, is even the Vice Prime Minister of Germany. So they're really part of the government. But on the other hand, they are the ones who have to keep the spending ministries in control. And a subsidy report, among other purposes, is also a very helpful instrument to keep subsidies more or less at bay. So tax expenditures in this report, I'm not talking about mainly about report, but all the things we did in evaluations, they all feed back into this report. So this is quite the central topic, and this is what you see here is a 40-page English version, so you can read it if you don't want to read the 470 German pages. It covers all tax expenditures and all tax subsidies of all levels, and that has to do with one German peculiarity. We have taxes on the local level, on the regional and the state level, and on the federal level, but the tax legislation is always central. So it's quite a centralized federalism. We don't have even the taxes which accrues exclusively to the local level, or which accrue exclusively to the lender, they are mainly legislated on the central level. And that's why the central level is the level where all major tax subsidies are decided at and reported at. So it's not, of course, it's not the government, it's the central parliament, but still it's the central level. So, and it covers, this report covers, and also our evaluation covers, it does not cover only direct taxes. Often we see tax expenditures mainly with a respect to personal income taxes or corporate income taxes. We have that in Germany as well, but we do have, as most countries do have, we have a lot of tax expenditures also in indirect taxation, be it in the value-added taxes, be it massive tax expenditures in energy taxes, other special consumption taxes, inheritance taxes. Basically, in all taxes we use, we have also tax expenditures. Okay, and this tax subsidy report, it covers all these things. It has overview articles, very readable, but it has, which is even more important for the control and for those who evaluate these things, it has massive amounts of annexes where every single program and every single tax expenditure is counted and reported for on a 2 or 3 page special small and uniform such papers. And and that is the level where evaluation starts. Evaluation of tax expenditures in Germany is a twofold thing. On the one hand, you see in the lower line, which is of course important also for you, the Federal Court of Auditors, they do cover tax expenditures and they do report on that and they evaluate them, but they don't have they don't do it on the regular basis. Only then and now annual reports cover sometimes more, sometimes less tax expenditure. There is no full coverage. And but the Ministry of Finance does more and more take care that evaluations are produced by economic research institutes like our institute. And currently, including the work we have done, the coverage for tax expenditures in all tax expenditures is roughly 82%. So that's quite a lot relating to the volume of the tax expenditures, and that's quite a lot also because, well, basically we started with the biggest one and worked down from that. So basically, if you start up, you of course you get quite easy a big amount. So when we look at tax expenditure numbers, there's a lot of little tax expenditures which are not evaluated so far. So that is, here I give you a final picture from this report, and because I'm not mainly reporting on the federal report, it just to give you an idea, these are only tax subsidies and other subsidies which are which accrue to the federal level. So the other levels are not covered here, although the figures are also in the report. And what we see is Germany over the years, here you have federal tax benefits as a part of federal tax revenue. And you see, okay, we over the years from the millennium till now, well, that's pre-COVID budget data, tax expenditures went up massively in reaction to COVID, as subsidies did, of course, as well. But okay, these data are from March, and then we didn't have these decisions made. You see, it's more or less stable. It's going down a little, but it's more or less stable. 5% of federal tax revenue, but the revenue has risen over the years. So basically, in real terms, it's a little more. And to give you an actual figure, in 2020, we had a federal revenue loss stemming from 105 tax expenditures of roughly 17 billion euros. And that is reflected by total tax losses of all levels of roughly 35 billion euros. So we're talking about quite a lot of money. And as we all know, tax expenditures need a special attention, need more scrutiny, because they stay out of the budget and have the tendency to be very long-lived. So what did we do? Basically, most of the evaluations done in Germany of tax expenditures have been accomplished within 2 rounds of evaluation, and these are the 2 rounds. And what you see, the first round was about 10 years ago, or 13 years ago. It started in 2007 to 2009, and the second round started by coincidence 10 years later and ended also 10 years later. And both rounds were, these are the institutes which did it. And you see, this is my institute, and in both cases, we are a small institute, but we specialize a little in subsidies as well. So we headed both consortia of research institutes. This is ZEV is a big German economic research institute. Copenhagen Economics is a very fine Danish economists firm. They participated in the first round, and in the second round, basically it was a tender, but we won again the contract because we accomplished to get all those institutes who would have been competitors into our consortium. So if you can't beat them, join them game. But it was interesting. Here in the second round, you see it's 4 institutes. These are the 2. This is one of the biggest German research institutes. ZEV is also very big. And Fraunhofer, they are specialists in quantifying tax expenditures, which is always a special issue, but they are really very good on micro data, and that is. Okay, just to give you an overview, 20 tax expenditures in the first round, 33 tax expenditures in the second round, but in the first round, it were the 20 biggest. So we had a volume of then 18 billion euros total, not only federal level, but state level, local level as well. And in the second round, we had more tax expenditures, but less volume, because the biggest had already been evaluated. So we had a volume of together 8 billion euros. And okay, what we produced were evaluation reports. And when you have scientists working on these things, they work really diligently. You see, it's first evaluation reports were 3 volumes of 650 pages. And the second round, 6 volume of altogether 1,020 pages. So I'm not trying to give an overview of more than 1,600 pages. Well, we go just mainly into the methodical issues, just to give you an idea of how we did it. And just this, what I show you now is the evaluation also already of the second round. In the first round, we applied a framework which is similar to that, but it was a little simpler. It was the first time this was done. So when we did this started this in 2007, basically this had never been done in Germany. And it started with actually the biggest evaluation, 18 billion euros, the biggest evaluation ever done so far in Germany, and as far as I know, in the world. So it was quite, actually it wasn't paid that good, but we needed a new framework, and we needed a framework which should accomplish one task. We had very, very different taxes. Not only very different taxes, income taxes, direct taxes, indirect taxes, very different indirect taxes, and also very different purposes of the tax subsidies. And still, but we had one framework and we needed to have more or less comparable procedures, although of course every single tax expenditures needs its own evaluation, because we have to evaluate, of course, what we find. We have to evaluate the objectives and the concrete text. And what we did is we used criteria, as you see, quite standard criteria, which are not surprising to anyone doing these things, because that's the thing an economist would always ask and look for. What were the criteria? You see them here. Our criteria now are 5 big criteria. The first is the relevance of the objective. So we evaluated whether it made sense, whether it made economically sense. And that's actually already one of the most critical issues, because evaluating the objective is going directly into the policy issues. So and asking whether was this policy, did it make sense or not? Of course, you have to be careful on that, because it's not the job of the scientists to judge policy by itself, but at least see whether it made sense also in the terms of our economic order. And the second one, and the second biggest one, is of course already the effectiveness. Does it do its job? How good does it do its jobs? And you want to do that on an empirical basis. Ideally, you have also a causal analysis. That's what we economists love to do, but causal empirics are quite hard to establish, especially if you don't have the choice what you want to evaluate, but it's your job to evaluate what you get. Okay, the third, and also one of the biggest issues now, we didn't evaluate that 10 years ago, is sustainability. So we have 17 global sustainability objectives, the SDGs, and they are step by step applied to all fields of federal and also the other policy areas. So they have become the sustainability agenda of the German federal government. Does also relate to all its programs, also the other programs. So we had to start looking whether all the tax expenditures we looked at were compatible with the sustainability issues, and whether or not they touched on any of the 63 indicators which are used in Germany to measure our performance relative to sustainability goals. And then an old one, an instrumental suitability, as we call it, means just, okay, if it works and whatever, but is it best designed? Or could it be designed any better? Should it be a tax expenditure is the first question. And if you say yes, and should not be a direct subsidy, then you ask, okay, is it best of all possible ways designed as a tax expenditure, or could we design it any differently? And we get a lot of interesting findings in this field. And then finally, transparency and monitoring. That means just how transparent are these things handled? How good are they monitors on a regular basis? Because all the things we evaluated were evaluated for the first time, and many of the tax expenditures were decades old, 30, 40 years old. So monitoring is always an issue. And from that, we build a total assessment, and we score. I'll show you how we score tax subsidies. Just on the next slide, we score every single criterion or every single dimension, and then we aggregate them on the equal way each score. But there are 2 knockout criteria. So if the relevance or the effectiveness here on the left side, if they are, for example, bad, it can't be any better. So a tax expenditure which is irrelevant or which is not effective in reaching its objective, it can be as transparent as it wants. It can't be any better than the judgment on this. So these KO criteria, knockout criteria mean it can't be any better than what we find here. But if it's good on that side, okay, the others have also an impact. And the scoring is also quite simple, quite straightforward. Actually, what everyone would do, we try to, as you see here, insufficient, weak, sufficient, good, and excellent. That's the figure we use as a scoring value, but that's not. And what does that mean? As you see it here, not acceptable in any way to nothing can be improved anymore. And here in the middle, there's somehow, well, grade C and the lowest passing grade in school, and that's what we also use as an orientation. And these criteria are applied to each tax expenditure and to each dimension, but individually, because we have very different goals, we have very different tax expenditures, so you can't, from that on, it can't be any more uniform. It has to be individual because you work on individual taxes on individual purposes, and you have to value these. And here is just one idea. That's in German, so please forgive me if you may not understand. That's just an excerpt from our 2019 scores for income tax benefits, and there's very, very different income tax benefits. Some here, this is for agriculture, then we have for monument protection, and well, very different reasons. And you see how it works out. Here's the relevance, the effectiveness, the sustainability, instrumental suitability and transparency. Each measure gets its own scoring, and these scorings are basically found by economists talking to each other, arguing with another, arguing also with other people in the field, whether or not this should be the right thing, and basically finding an evaluation for that. And as you see, these things count up to, well, sometimes good, or sometimes good, sometimes not so good results. In this field here, basically, our total scores were very, well, not very good, to be honest, because we see the most of the scores where it says actually there must be some improvement and it's necessary because they're weak. We have also fields where we would say it's better. So the evaluation gave as a result. I give you the results just to give you an overview how these things look. Here now in English, the results for the first round on the top side of the page, and you see here basically we had, well, on even some tax expenditure which were excellent in their relevance, and also, well, effectiveness excellent is very seldom. I don't have to tell you that, but basically at the total assessments of all these 33 we had in the second round, well, the center in the middle, that's more or less unsurprising, but in the middle means, well, sufficient. So there's a lot of room for improvement, and we show where. And just to give you an impression of the old evaluation, and 10 years ago, there we had only one traffic light. So we accumulated all of our findings into one single traffic light for each tax expenditures, and we had, as you see, 5 were green, so good, Yellow were on a 10 were on a yellow, so revise it please, and 5 were on and well, abolish that. And basically that was great for the media, because they love these simple messages, and it went very well in the media at that time. But it's for the acceptance within tax policy and in the parliament, and for those people who you want to reach also with simple evaluations like that, they don't go that well, and it's much more transparent also from our side, and it's much more credible if you have your judgments in a way like this. And so summing up, so was this effort, so and just to give you this one, what you see, these 2 rounds of evaluation of tax expenditures, they make up most of the 82% you see. So there have happened a few other tax expenditure evaluations in the last years, but also a few without our help. But these were actually the 2 big efforts to do this. So it's a regular basis, but we have done it only twice. So it's not really regular, and nobody's committed himself to doing this. So, but was it an improvement? Or was it successful or not? Yes, in so far as it brought substantial improvements of knowledge. We didn't know anything about these issues. Tax expenditures were, until that time, tax expenditures were not a big issue in Germany, totally unlike the US, which we will hear soon. So it was an improvement for us. And it set standards in Germany, and we were quite proud to have also quite a good international discussion on that. But on the other hand, no, it wasn't successful because it didn't have any direct consequences for actual tax policies. So we delivered these evaluations, and as you have seen, they were certainly not always flattering. And what happened? Well, actually, basically nothing happened. And you might say, well, on the one hand, of course, it's not the job of politics just to follow scientists who say, well, you don't do a good job. And democratic government works differently, and certainly it would work better when the recommendations trickle down to the public, trickle down to the media. So actually, it was bad timing, as you said. It would have had more impact if, while by coincidence, we wouldn't have ended always in a big crisis. As you see, 2009, when we presented our results, we were in the starting of, well, what we then thought to be the biggest economic crisis for ages. And of course, nobody on the political level, and even we wouldn't have recommended that, would, in the middle of a crisis, start to cut down on subsidies. No, they kept them, and some of them were even broadened, just to have more macroeconomic impact on private consumption. So bad timing on the first side. Well, we thought when we presented at the end of 2019, better timing, but, well, I don't have to tell you, timing wasn't as good as well. There were only a few months of trickling down the results, and then we had this big Corona, now COVID pandemic, worldwide crisis, and again, German government had to, like all the other governments, had to step in massively. Not reduce subsidies, but keep all the subsidies you have and put on that even more subsidies. So it's really a bad time for tax expenditure evaluations. Tough luck. But actually, these things do not only work when they're just presented. Of course, then you have the media buzz, or you can try to build a media buzz. But but they are there. And whenever somebody in normal times again starts on working on these taxes, these tax evaluations cannot. They exist, and their judgments are valid for quite some time. And thankfully, also the Federal Court of Auditors always picks up also our reports and gets them out whenever they are in Parliament and talk about new tax expenditures. So there may be more influence and then we see on first hand, because while it's the slow and influence which evaluations have, and which are actually their job. So basically, that was it. Sorry, that is for talking so long, or for not talking longer. The topic asks for a lot. I'll stop sharing my. Oh, you already stopped it. Thank you very much, Rafa, so far.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michael Thorne. It is amazing how you managed to develop such a comprehensive and in-depth study of tax expenditures in Germany. I think it will be very good for our development of our model here in TCU. So now let's hear Andy Morrison, Director of Value for Money Audit of the National Audit Office from the United Kingdom. Please, Andy.
Thank you. Really interesting to hear Michael's presentation as well. I can only really dream of us having that level of evaluation in the UK. But anyway, let me talk you through our experience here. And one thing just to say about myself, so I've been involved in the UK auditing of tax expenditures for about 5 or 6 years, so since about 2014, which is really when we started looking at this area. And so what I plan to cover, can everyone see the presentation, by the way? Can I just check that? Can you see it?
Yeah, we see it.
Yeah, great. So I just plan to cover the UK kind of perspective in terms of the significance of tax expenditures here, how we've developed our approach to auditing them, and then to highlight some key models and assessment tools that might be useful for you, and then briefly at the end to kind of recap on our the impact of our work over the past 5 years or so. So in the UK, we have a lot of tax expenditures. We have 360, and that is a pretty new number. When we started looking at this in 2014, the UK had categorised around about 50 tax reliefs as tax expenditures, and there were a large number of other reliefs, over 1,000. We served a variety of objectives, but actually visibility wasn't very clear. So they amount to a significant cost, about 150 billion in 2018-19, approximately 7% in terms of our GDP, and most of that value is accounted for by actually quite a small number, relatively small number, so around about 23 tax expenditures, which is shown in the diagram here. Most of those relate to either pensions or various reliefs from sales tax, or they're particular things designed to encourage investment or saving. So they do tend to be things which are which need to be done through the tax system. And the cost has been rising in real terms for some time. It has slowed in recent years, but compared to when we first started doing this, the cost has gone up by about 50 billion. So very significant. In the UK, all tax reliefs are administered by the Finance Department, the Treasury, and administered by the Tax Office, Revenue and Customs. It is an entirely centralized model. There are no sort of local levels with these things for the most part. They're all centralized. While policy development might be done in some departments, for the most part, the policy is owned by the finance department. So just a brief overview of the work that we've done. When we first came to this, there was little visibility of tax reliefs. Indeed, we didn't really understand how to go about categorizing them. And so most of our early work in 2014 was a kind of factual piece. So the first report in April 2014 really just set out the landscape, tried to provide a kind of total view of how many tax reliefs there were in the UK and the different types. But we soon followed that up in November 2014 with an evaluative piece that looked at how the tax authority, rather than the Treasury, how the tax authority went about administering reliefs. And since then, we've followed up in 2016, and then more recently in February this year, we did a larger piece which included the finance department substantially for the first time. And just to explain, all of our reports are taken in Parliament by the Public Accounts Committee, which is a cross-party committee of MPs. They hold the civil servants to account for the administration of the tax system, and that includes the administration of tax reliefs. And they've been very supportive of the work that we've done and keen to see much greater visibility and scrutiny of tax reliefs in the UK. So I'll just cover our framework for assessing tax expenditures, and an important distinction, I think, between us and certainly Germany and probably other countries is that our remit does not extend to looking at the effectiveness or the value for money of the tax reliefs themselves. That is categorized as a policy matter for legislators and for ministers. So our remit focuses on the use of the resources by government departments to administer the tax reliefs. And what we are particularly interested in when we've been looking at how Treasury and HMRC have administered their reliefs is really whether we see active management. And that is summarized in the figure here, which is really a cycle of management, a management cycle based around initial design, implementation and sort of monitoring how tax reliefs are working, and then more sort of formal evaluation and feedback to go back in and inform the design or redesign of tax reliefs. And that active management is really important because generally tax reliefs can be quite invisible and often politically it's not always in people's interests to assess how well the policies are working. So, you know, our role is important in making sure that that is happening, really. And I'll come on in more detail on these different elements and the work that we do to assess each of those things. This was a framework that we developed in consultation with both academics and tax administrators. It has sort of developed and refined over time, but broadly, these sort of core principles have stood us really well in our work. So how do we assess the design of tax expenditures? We have a framework here where we've identified a number of sort of key criteria that we're looking to see done in the administration of tax relief. So I won't go through all of them, but they are things which are probably familiar to many of you. So things like making sure that the objectives are set out clearly, estimating what the costs and impacts are likely to be, comparing that policy and the sort of cost benefit expectations of that policy to spending alternatives, and also sort of identifying risks like avoidance or deadweight loss, and considering how to manage those. The area, so for the most part, what we found when we looked at a small sample last year was that for the most part, most of the steps that we would expect have been followed. But objectives are often not very specific. So it's often unclear whether a tax relief is trying to achieve a behavioural change or not. And often there's little thought or explanation given to how the relief will be evaluated. So there's a risk that when most reliefs are introduced, that there's then not a clear timetable or method really set for judging whether they've been successful or not. And clearly that's important when deciding whether a relief should continue or not. Important information for policymakers. On the administration side, there we're looking for active management by Revenue and Customs, the tax administration. One of the areas that we have been particularly focused on is understanding of the costs and how those change over time. Not all tax reliefs in the UK are costed, but most of the large ones are. And one of the things that the UK does, which is good, is when they introduce a new relief, they set out what the tax exchequer impact is going to be over the next 5 years. And so we have a baseline against which we can compare the actual costs to the expected costs. And when we first started, that wasn't something which was routinely done, and indeed remains an area that can be improved by the tax authority. And we have seen some where there are very big differences. So the example here is of a tax relief called Entrepreneurs Relief, which was introduced around 2008-09. And very quickly, the cost for that relief exceeded the expectations set out in policy forecasts. Even with those differences, it took some time before the relief was properly evaluated. It is only recently, really, that the combination of looking at the costs and understanding the findings from the evaluation, which found the relief was not very effective in influencing behaviour change, it's only recently that relief has actually been refined and scaled back. So really it's sort of taken 6 years of us bringing that to the attention of government before we've seen any action to really act on that. So in terms of evaluating tax reliefs or tax expenditures, we sort of set out the areas that we would expect the departments to be looking at when they assess the impact. And the areas are summarised in this table here. We would expect some initial baselining against which to judge performance, and then assessment of the total benefits, whether there has been behavioural change or not, consideration of whether there's been deadweight loss or particular tax avoidance using tax reliefs, or indeed leakage to areas or groups not expected to be using a relief. We would like to see quantification of the sort of cost-benefit ratio and monitoring of the softer outcomes that might be associated with particular reliefs. So this was an assessment we first did in 2014. We saw quite fragmented practice overall. You can see a lot of crosses. There was normally something done for most reliefs, but it was quite variable. Now, this year, Treasury have a similar framework. So the finance department have now got a similar framework, which they use to much more systematically assess the value for money of tax reliefs, and we've seen a much better level of performance overall. Still a few crosses, but generally practice getting much better. And I think in total they look at around 60 or 70 reliefs each year. That is a part of the policy process, so that is not published, but we are able to look at the assessments behind the scenes and report on whether the steps we expect to be taken are being followed. And just the recognition, really, I think that in the UK, our practice is developing. One of the areas that we found incredibly helpful in influencing government is to look at the experience in other countries. The figure here just summarizes some of the things which are done in Netherlands, Germany, France, Ireland, and Canada. These are the areas that our finance department, the countries that our finance department have looked at. I would add the work of the GAO in the US to the good practice examples that we have referred to as well, but these are just the ones that the finance department have used. And the features that we see as being particularly good from across those countries is regular evaluations of tax expenditures against established frameworks, regular and detailed reporting on tax expenditures. That point about transparency is really important to have accountability, and then mechanisms to review the value of tax expenditures over time. So examples would be sort of time limits, or what are often called sunset clauses on particular reliefs, or just setting parameters for when things should be looked at. So, I mean, after 6 years, what has changed? We do see better and more consistent administration of tax expenditures in the UK. Now there are nominated officials responsible for every tax expenditure, and there is government guidance and good practice which they're required to follow. There's much greater transparency, so we now have a list of all the tax expenditures with costs, and more information on why costs vary, the government is continuing to improve on that. So they've recently made further commitments to improve the commentary around why the costs of particular reliefs have changed. And the value for money of major tax expenditures is regularly assessed. What we think is left to do, well, quicker responses where problems are identified or costs exceed forecasts. So that example I gave of entrepreneurs relief is a good example of one where it really takes a long time between a relief being introduced to then being able to assess and evaluate it, and then actually make the change through the government legislative process. We would like to see a more comprehensive and structured approach to evaluations, something more systematic and transparent. And we still think that there is scope to improve clarity around the purpose and objective of particular tax expenditures, particularly as these can change over time as the world changes and as government priorities change. So thank you for your attention. I've included in the presentation a list of the relevant reports that we've produced. Some of these include more technical things around, for instance, how to define, measure and evaluate tax expenditures, which can be quite helpful in terms of understanding the sort of academic perspective, which is really helpful to draw upon, I think, when carrying out this sort of work. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andy. If you can please turn off the share of the screen. Thank you very much for your presentation. TCU has a long partnership with NAO, mainly in the development of performance audit framework. And here on the subject of tax expenditures, the work developed by you is also a great benchmark for the development of our assessment framework. Now, I pass the floor to Jay McTighe, Director of Strategic Issues of the Government Accountability Office from the United States. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Raphael. Thank you very much. Let's see if I can upload the presentation here. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Still, okay. Trying to get back to the Teams screen here. Did my presentation go away, or do you still see it?
Yeah, it's still visible.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank you very much for inviting GAO to this webinar. GAO has been interested in tax expenditures for some time, both given the lack of oversight of tax expenditures, as well as the revenue loss associated with tax expenditures at the federal level. I'm going to start with a little context on tax expenditures in the United States, and then give a high-level overview of our evaluation framework. I'm also joined today with my colleague, Mary Lynn Sargent, who will provide some additional detail about specific application of the framework that we have done over in recent years. And so let's see. I think I'll go through this slide very quickly. Obviously, tax expenditures, the definition that we use is very familiar to everybody on this webinar. Basically, special credits, deductions, exemptions, and exclusions from taxations or deferrals of tax liability and preferential tax rates that deviate from a normal tax. I do want to point out that we have no national VAT or consumption tax in the US, so our focus is on income taxes as our baseline. As such, the Department of Treasury for 2019 estimated the total sum of tax expenditures at $1.3 trillion, and that's over 165 unique tax expenditures. However, like some other countries that we've heard about today, the largest 10 tax expenditures account for the vast majority, almost 3/4 of that amount. Currently, we do not account for or estimate tax expenditures for other baselines such as social insurance, excise, or estate taxes. On this slide, you can see the growth in tax expenditures over, I guess, the last 2 decades, or three decades, I should say. The yellow line represents the sum of tax expenditures, and you can see the data shown here are in 2019 dollars, so we are talking about real growth. Since about 2000, the sum of tax expenditures has ranged between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion, the equivalent of roughly 6 to 7% of GDP. And in many years, or in several years, tax expenditures have exceeded the amount of spending that is appropriated annually. And that's the blue line in the chart here. And I make that comparison because appropriated annual discretionary spending receives a lot more attention in the budget than, say, for example, mandatory or entitlement spending, that's the green line, or tax expenditures. But yet, tax expenditures represent an amount roughly equivalent to what is spent through annually appropriated dollars. It's also important to note that the majority of tax expenditures that we're looking at relate to individual income taxes rather than corporate income taxes. In some years, this number has been about 90% of the sum of revenue loss from tax expenditures. On this slide, it kind of gives a high-level view of some of the key events in the recognition and movement toward providing greater oversight and evaluation of tax expenditures in the U.S. It was not that long ago, 1974, where the Congressional Budget Act actually defined what a tax expenditure is and required annual estimates. So right now, the Department of Treasury, as well as the Joint Committee on Taxation in the Congress, provide annual estimates and lists of tax expenditures. In 1993, the Government Performance and Results Act became the law and required on the spending side of the budget performance measurement as well as program evaluations. On the heels of that law, in 1994, GAO recommended developing an evaluation framework. And I should point out here, and maybe many of you on this call are aware that the federal system of government in the US is similar to Brazil in that we have an independent executive branch, an independent legislative branch, and an independent judiciary branch. And GAO is part of the legislative branch, and therefore we do not run individual programs. We're not part of the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury, and so a lot of our work, all of our work, is at the request of the legislative branch, the Congress, and we make recommendations to the executive branch in terms of how to improve programs. And we also make recommendations to the Congress in terms of how to improve policy. And that's what we did in '94. We recommended that the executive branch develop a framework. Nothing happened. And again, in 2005, we made similar recommendations in terms of implementing some system that not only looked at individual agency goals and the tax expenditures related with their missions, but also in a lot of cases, tax expenditures span many different agencies and program areas. And still, the gist of the recommendation was to put in place a framework, a more formal, regular evaluation of tax expenditures. Unfortunately, again, not too much happened. There was additional legislation that in 2011, the Government Performance and Results Act, Modernization Act, which added to the GPRA of '93, but explicitly included tax expenditures in terms of measuring performance and evaluating programs. In 2012, GAO came out with our own framework, given the lack of progress that was being made by the executive branch in terms of developing their own framework and institutionalizing a more rigorous review. So that takes us to my next slide, and here you see a picture of the evaluation guide that we put out. And as it says, we basically outline questions. We kept it at a fairly high level, and what we did was we really built on our prior work looking at tax expenditures more broadly, and as I said, the lack of progress in the executive branch in developing a regular and systematic evaluation of tax expenditures. The framework also drew upon longstanding criteria for evaluating tax policy, as well as GAO's vast experience in the evaluation of spending programs. And as others have pointed out, many tax expenditures can be viewed as spending channeled through the tax code, and therefore evaluating tax expenditures, policymakers should ask many of the same types of questions as they would for any program, spending or tax expenditure, irregardless. We did draw upon, the work of several, international examples, Germany, UK, and others, as well as some states in the U.S. that had moved a little bit more forward than the federal government. But we also consulted with a diverse array of experts, as well as the various audiences that might use such a guide. And I want to point out that these 5 questions that I have up on the screen right now, as you can see, are pretty broad, overarching questions, and they also address different perspectives on tax expenditures. And we did that on purpose so that users can apply the framework either comprehensively, for a full-blown evaluation, or look at particular aspects of tax expenditures, whether or not it's meeting its stated purpose, or is it good policy in terms of efficiency, equity, and simplicity? How does it interact with other types of federal tools, including spending programs or regulation? And then the last question is, how often and when should tax expenditures be evaluated? And I think this is one of the strengths of the framework that we put together, that it can be used in varying degrees of rigor. It can be used at different points in the life of a tax expenditure. Everything from when a tax expenditure is being conceived and designed to a more robust evaluation of an existing tax expenditure. So now I'd like to quickly run through these 5 questions that we've outlined. And again, the very first question, it's pretty obvious, but not always that well known. What is the purpose of a given tax expenditure? It's definitely the necessary first step in determining how the tax expenditure's performance should be assessed. What are the goals? What are the objectives of the program? However, as simple as that sounds, it's not always that easy to determine, particularly in our experience, where a tax expenditure's purpose may not be clearly defined in the legislation that created it, or there may be multiple purposes for the tax expenditure, and people may have different constituencies may have different ideas in terms of what is the purpose of a given tax expenditure. Having identified a purpose, the next step obviously is, how do you measure whether or not the tax expenditure is actually achieving the identified objective? And while performance measures can help illustrate that point, performance measurement can also contribute to more broader evaluations. So data on the actual performance, what it is achieving, is obviously crucial to any assessment of a tax expenditure. Looking at the second question, and this goes to the heart of most traditional economically driven analyses, and there are various criteria that can be used. Obviously, we talked about the purpose of the tax expenditure. That could be used as criteria, but also whether or not a given tax expenditure is good policy or good tax policy. And this draws upon the volume of literature, tax policy literature, in terms of looking at economic efficiency, taxpayer equity, and also the administrability of the program. And under efficiency, it's a familiar questions in terms of what is the benefit to society of the activity, what are the costs of the resources used to generate the tax expenditure's benefits, and then finally, do the benefits of the tax expenditure exceed its costs? Moving to equity, does the tax expenditure result in different benefits for similarly situated taxpayers? Do taxpayers with different abilities to pay receive different benefits from the tax expenditure? And then, finally, who actually benefits from the tax expenditures? Is it broad-based? Is it particular populations or groups? And then finally, the third aspect of good policy, is the tax expenditure simple, transparent, and administrable? What are the planning, the record keeping, the reporting, and other compliance costs, both for taxpayers in using the tax expenditure, and then what are the costs to, the tax authority or other agency in terms of administering the tax expenditure? And then finally, and maybe the most important, can taxpayers understand how the tax expenditure works? Both in terms of, a broad policy perspective, but also in terms of whether or not or how they can take advantage of the tax expenditure. And, the whole purpose of a lot of tax expenditures is to influence behavior, but if it's not accessible to a given population, that is not ideal. Obviously, these tax policy criteria may sometimes conflict with one another, and some are kind of subjective. So as a result, there will always be trade-offs among the criteria. Okay, turning to the third question. How does the tax expenditure relate to other federal programs? And this is an area that's of particular interest to the GAO. We have, for about a decade now, looked at overlap, duplication, and fragmentation across the federal government in terms of service delivery and programs. And a lot of focus, as is typical, is on the spending side of the budget. But what we'd like to emphasize as well is that tax expenditures, play a very important role. I showed you the numbers earlier. There's a lot of money behind those. And so when another aspect of looking at tax expenditures should be, how does it contribute to a stated goal, whether for a particular agency or multiple agencies, and how do the different programs under their jurisdiction relate to one another, including the tax expenditures, to ensure that there's not duplication or overlap with different efforts coming from, the same agency or different agencies. It's essential, we think, for tax expenditures really to be viewed from that standpoint, to be coordinated with other activities. As I said, spending programs being, the prime example, but also regulation. Are there other tools of government that are being used to achieve the same objective, to achieve the same outcome? And it's essential to coordinate all of those efforts. And then finally, under this question, are there other designs of given tax expenditure that could be used to more effectively achieve the purpose that is desired? Different designs of the tax expenditure, or as I mentioned earlier, different policy tools such as spending and regulation. Okay, moving to the fourth question that we've outlined, what are the consequences for the federal budget of tax expenditures? And, this is almost always a key question on the spending side of the budget. But as we've all acknowledged, oversight and accounting of tax expenditures is not as visible or transparent. But furthermore, are all the budgetary and revenue effects captured in the measurement of a given tax expenditure? Whether eliminating or creating a tax expenditure, what is the revenue loss, not just due to the tax expenditure at hand, but looking at the interaction with other tax expenditures, as well as any interactions and correlations with spending on the the outlay side of the budget. And I think Andy touched a little bit upon this aspect too. Are there options for limiting the tax expenditure's revenue loss? Can the aggregate amount be capped, for example? Can eligibility for the tax expenditure be restricted, or can the value of the tax expenditure for a given taxpayer be reduced in other ways, phase outs and whatnot? So the overall impact on the federal fisc is something we think is very important here. Let's see. Well, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. I had the wrong slide up, but in terms of how should the evaluation of the tax expenditure be managed, again, others have talked a little bit about this, but one of the questions that we have in the U.S. is that, given that tax expenditures are embedded in the tax code, sharing data and administration of the tax expenditure with program or mission-focused agencies can be problematic, and that may further hinder oversight of a given tax expenditures. The Internal Revenue Service, our tax authority, primarily is charged with enforcing the tax code, and it's really not in its mission to worry about housing policy, education policy, etc. And we have done work in this area looking at different arrangements that would allow sharing of the responsibility or designating a given agency to provide to be in charge of the oversight of a given tax expenditure. Right now, that's not always clear. And then, when should the tax expenditure be evaluated? There are different options. For example, regular or periodic reviews, or evaluating a tax expenditure before it's enacted or before it's extended. How do you select what tax expenditures to be evaluated? Obviously, you can rely on judgment. You can also do the selection based on established criteria. And unfortunately, none of that is actually currently in place in the US. And then lastly, what type of data are needed to evaluate tax expenditures? As I alluded to earlier, the Internal Revenue Service in the USA does not have sufficient data on many tax expenditures to allow for any kind of rigorous evaluation. To collect more data would probably require additional legislation by our Congress, and would also involve additional costs. So clearly, there are challenges to accomplishing any of the activities and assessments that I've outlined under the 5 broad questions. And on this slide, it just summarized a couple that we talked about. Identifying purpose, that's crucial to any kind of questions or assessment evaluation that you might want to undertake. Data availability, I was talking about that a minute ago. And shortly after this guide came out, GAO did look at data availability for across the tax expenditures that were in effect in 2013, and we found that more than 60% of the tax expenditures were not on a tax return or information return that submitted to the IRS, or that they did not have their own line item. And this obviously complicates any kind of assessment or evaluation. IRS is not required to collect or evaluate data other than those which are required for tax administration, as I mentioned earlier. But having these types of data, really can facilitate all kinds of analysis, key analysis, including distributional analyses, and even more basically, having a better understanding of the scope and magnitude of a given tax expenditure. And then finally, selecting audit criteria. I've kind of covered that with the 5 questions. The 5 questions do serve to propose, various different criteria, including, tax policy criteria, which was embedded in the 2nd question. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Mary Lynn Sargent, who is going to just run through some examples of the work that GAO has done in terms of looking at individual tax expenditures, either at the request of Congress or mandates that we receive. So Mary Lynn, I will turn it over to you to finish up.
And can you hear me?
We can.
All right, so just to give a recap, a little bit of feedback here. A recap of the kinds of work that we do for the GAO evaluations is we do work, as Jay said, on behalf of requests from the Congress. Sometimes we will have mandates by law to look at specific tax expenditures, but we do not have a broad mandate to regularly audit tax expenditures. We do several basic kinds of work. We've done work looking at the governance of tax expenditures in aggregate. For example, our recommendations for executive branch oversight, the work looking across tax expenditures at the general availability of data for tax administration. We've also looked at how tax expenditures fit into the congressional budget process. The other kinds of jobs we do look at the design, effectiveness, and administration of specific tax expenditures. And those jobs can result in recommendations either to our legislature for suggestions to change the law, or recommendations to the tax administrator on guidance or ways to change their operation to deal with effectiveness and compliance issues. And then a particular theme in our work is looking for those areas of duplication and how tax expenditures as a policy tool fit together with the other federal programs that we use to achieve policy. So turning to slide 13 and how we've actually used the framework. We've had one job where we took the framework and we applied it in full, and that was in 2013. We did evaluations of the 2 largest corporate tax expenditures. It was descriptive work. We did not make recommendations to the Congress or recommendations to the Internal Revenue Service based on that work. But it shows that the framework can be used. It's hard to do it in the full framework for more than one tax expenditure in our traditional reporting format. More typically, what we do is the framework will be used in pieces to inform the design of a job and its scope. And a good example of a job where we looked at that key question of, is the tax expenditure good policy? We did a report looking at the research tax credit, and we did quantitative analysis of tax data. And what we revealed was that the current design of the credit distributes the incentives unevenly. There were windfalls from more than half of them claiming the credit. And so we had a number of recommendations to the Congress to improve the design of that credit. Congress makes their choices. Those suggestions to the Congress are still open. At the time that we did that work, we also found there was insufficient guidance from the tax administrator, and that led to disputes and higher compliance costs for taxpayers that diminished the credit's incentive. A number of those recommendations to Treasury and IRS have been implemented. And I think where we are now, nearly a decade out from that work, is we do plan to do another evaluation of the research tax credit and look at where we are with the use of that tax credit, and again, bring new analysis to demonstrate the value of the recommendations we'd previously made to improve the tax expenditures design. So turning to slide 14, I think this is a bigger body of work that we do, is looking at whether a tax expenditure is simple, transparent, and administrable. And here on the slide, there are two examples of ways we've approached this. We did work several years ago looking at the breadth of federal programs for subsidizing higher education cost. And in that mix of programs, there were multiple tax expenditures in addition to grants and loans. And what we found, again, quantitative analysis looking at statistical tax data, is that many tax filers failed to claim a tax benefit, or they didn't claim the one that was most advantageous to them. So it's helping the Congress understand how the programs fit together, and do taxpayers understand how to use them. Another example of work that GAO has done in this area is looking at refundable tax credits. Now, these are credits where the amount returned to the taxpayer is in excess of their tax liability. So basically is quite literally spending through the tax code. And so there's a lot of public policy focus in the United States on these refundable tax credits, and if there are improper payments or people committing fraud to get the advantage of these refunds. And so we looked at the eligibility rules and found that they contributed to the compliance burden, both for the taxpayers as well as cost for the government to administer the refundable credits. They don't have third-party data available to verify what the people are claiming. And this, between the complexity and the lack of data, you've got a high overclaim error rates by the taxpayers, and it's difficult for the tax administrator to make sure they're getting the refunds out correctly. So that's been a large body of work for us. Turning to slide 15. This is where we've had some substantial payoffs, is things that you may not think of as traditional evaluations of tax expenditures, is our efforts to look at, does a tax expenditure duplicate or overlap with another federal effort? And so we did work looking at the federal programs related to domestic biofuel production. And what we found was that there had been a longer standing tax credit in the area that was basically superseded by a newer regulatory standard. And, Congress, in response to those findings, allowed that tax credit to expire. It was, while most of our tax expenditures are evergreen and don't have expiration dates, that particular one did. And by elevating to its congressional attention that tax expenditure was duplicative of the regulatory framework, eliminating that tax credit resulted in nearly $6 billion in revenue savings for 2012. So it was a significant, improvement in getting rid of a single tax expenditure. Another area that we've helped the Congress understand and trying to bring some changes in executive branch capacity is we looked at the low-income housing tax credit, which is the largest federal subsidy for production of affordable rental housing. It is a complex program administered in part by the federal tax administrator, the Internal Revenue Service, in coordination with state housing finance agencies. And what we found was the tax administrator is focusing on compliance of the credit by the investors, and they were not providing much, if any, oversight for the state housing finance agencies. Those state housing finance agencies are also the same agencies that help carry out federal spending programs for federal housing programs. So one of the suggestions we had for the Congress is they designate the Federal Housing Department as a joint administrator with the tax administrator for the low-income housing credit. And this would provide the benefit of consolidated oversight of the state housing finance agencies, as well as being able to leverage the evaluation capacity in the housing department to evaluate the effectiveness. And then IRS would still continue to enforce the tax law, which is their area of specialty and expertise. So, Treasury and the Housing Department agreed with us on rebalancing and being able to tap the housing agency's effectiveness. At this point, Congress still hasn't officially moved to designate the housing agency as a joint administrator. But again, it's part of what we do is evaluating tax expenditures using portions of the framework, but then the big theme we keep behind our work is how do the tax expenditures fit into the portfolio of tools we use to achieve things in the United States? And from our perspective, does the executive branch have the capacity to carry out the tax expenditures and provide context and information about their effectiveness? Jay, I will turn it back to you.
Okay, just to quickly finish up here, tax expenditures are not going away. In fact, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 introduced some new tax expenditures, while at the same time modifying, the impact or the revenue loss of others. As others have mentioned, obviously the pandemic has required a large government intervention, and the CARES Act and other related legislation has introduced a number of other tax expenditures. One that I'll point out under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is something that we call opportunity zones, basically a tax expenditure, the objective of which is to incentivize investment in undeveloped and underserved areas. And we're doing some work on that as I speak. Unfortunately, what we have found so far is that, despite the progress that we have made in terms of raising awareness of tax expenditures and their impact on the federal fisc, and the need to evaluate such expenditures, the way the legislation was crafted really, did not provide for adequate data collection, and also really wasn't clear on, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the objectives of the program. So we will probably be making some findings related to that. Our report is due out in the next month or so, and we will continue to do work as that program is rolled out. And, as I said, while some progress has been made in terms of accounting for, estimating, and raising awareness of tax expenditures, we definitely feel and believe strongly that more needs to be done. And GAO every year now is highlighting recommendations that have not been implemented by the executive branch. And two of them relate to tax expenditures, and they're shown right here. And basically, they go to the heart of the matter in terms of putting in place a framework for regular review of tax expenditures, that are related to specific objectives and agency goals. So we're trying to keep the pressure on, working with the executive branch, working with the Congress to, further increase oversight of, this very important area of policy. So with that, I will conclude and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jay and Marilyn. If you can turn off the sharing of the screen. So I would like to thank you for Michael, Andy, Jay, and Marilyn for your presentations. I think that was great for us, not only for us here in TCU, but for all the spectators that are in YouTube. We have here some of the auditors from the Court of Accountants of our states in the Federation. We have researchers, we have people that work in the state's finance department. So I think this will be very good for us, and we will study your models, your frameworks very carefully to develop our own framework of evaluating these tax expenditures. Thank you very much again for your time. I think our time now it's over because it's more than noon here in Brazil. Okay. So I would like to thank you very much, and I will speak in Portuguese with our spectators. Muito obrigado, então, a todos vocês, pessoal, que estiveram aqui assistindo às nossas apresentações. Eu gostaria de lembrá-los que agora, pela manhã está sendo encerrado o painel, e nós teremos de tarde, então, 2 painéis voltados, o primeiro deles às 14 horas, para os aspectos fiscais dos gastos tributários, né, com o Senado
the
Federal,
fiscal
Tesouro
aspects in
Nacional
the
e o Tribunal
National
de Contas do Estado de
Congress,
São Paulo, o Ministério
for
Público do Tribunal
example,
de
with the
Contas.
participation of the state, the Court of Accounts of São Paulo, and then some national assessments of public expenditure, not only from here, but also from Rio de Janeiro. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and I'll see you again in the afternoon. Thank you.